All right, guys, here we are, and it's time to get started. In today's video, I'm going to show you a stretch that's going to help improve your hip internal rotation. Now, we know hip internal rotation is absolutely crucial as it's the fundamental movement of the hip. We're going to use an uncommon training position because most people are going to train hip internal rotation in like a 90-90 or a sleeper stretch, which is great. But we're going to use quadruped, which is a rare position to train IR in. But I find if you can nail the nuances, you're going to hit a part of your hip that you've never stretched before. It's going to really help open up that internal rotation. And what we're going to do is we're going to be on our hands and knees. So quadruped, which I infamously call quadruped, is where you're on your hands and knees. And there's two ways we can kind of go about creating internal rotation. So if this is my pelvis and this is my femur, the first way is where we rotate the femur inside of the pelvis. And the second way is where we turn the pelvis on top of the femur. So what I recommend is you're going to go up against a squat rack, a wall, or a box, something that's not going to move or give. That's super important. If you're up against a box and it starts to push and move, you're going to leave the stretch. Second, I recommend placing something squishy underneath the knees, just because anytime we do hip internal rotation, a lot of people get a little discomfort, generally in the inside of the knee, but that is going to allow you to kind of pivot and rotate. So if I go into quadruped and I place I'm going to be stretching my right hip in this video. I'm going to place my right foot or the inside of my heel up against the squat rack, and that is going to be where I create that pivot point or I create that torque. Now, if we were just turning the femur, what that looked like is if I rotate my foot out and my thigh rotates in, that's my femur. What we're going to do is we're going to do the opposite, where instead of turning the femur in, we're going to rotate the pelvis. You could call it out, but technically I'm turning my pelvis in towards that hip or that femur. So notice if I take my hips and I turn to the right, I'm creating that internal rotation. Now, there's a couple nuances that are going to make or break this stretch. If you don't nail the nuances, you might not even feel the stretch, and that's okay. I want you to definitely realize that you might need to adjust the angle to find the best stretch for you. Not everyone's going to stretch the same way. Not everyone's going to be restricted in the same part of the hip capsule. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a couple things. Number one, when I'm in quadruped here, what we're going to do is we're going to put this hip in a little bit of extension. Even though the hip is not in extension, we're going to flex the opposite hip. So what I mean by that is I'm going to bring this other knee up a little bit so that this hip is a little bit more in a position of extension. Now, you don't have to get crazy and actually put that hip in extension, but that's what we're going to do is we're going to flex the opposite hip. So if you need to adjust your pad, that's totally fine. I'm going to go here. Now, what I'm going to do here is I need to have a little bit of an anterior pelvic tilt. So if I tilt my pelvis to the ceiling and I create a little bit of an anterior pelvic tilt, that's going to create and open up some space in the back of the pelvis to allow that internal rotation. So anterior pelvic tilt, so we want to arch our back a little bit, get that. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to be shifting my hip. So if I think about, here's my right hip bone. If I think about shifting my hip out this way, which is going to look like that, it's going to actually adduct my femur, which means my knee is going to get dragged in towards my midline. So we're going to combine those couple movements to find the stretch, and then we're going to wind up. So that was a lot. That was probably confusing, and you probably now want to see the stretch, and that's totally fine. So we're going to wind up, which means, like I said, I'm going to rotate my pelvis over my femur, and I'm going to think that motion. Then we're going to adduct, which means shift the hip out, and then I'm going to get a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt. You don't need to go crazy. And if you do this right, you should feel the deepest, darkest part of your hip socket, and it's going to feel like a socket stretch. Now, the truth is, because our hips are sometimes they're differently shaped, sometimes we're restricted in different areas, you might find this stretches your left hip like crazy, and your right hip not as much. That's okay. And you shouldn't feel massive pain on the inside of your knee If so, you can adjust the height of your foot and stuff like that. So all fours right here. I'm going to get that hip shift, so I'm going to bring my opposite hip into flexion. And then, of course, right, you can have that wherever's best. Now I'm going to wind up. So ready? I'm going to wind up my pelvis here. And then let's go ahead. I'm going to get a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt. So notice I'm going to tilt that pelvis. And then ready? Now I'm going to shift my hip out. And notice I'm trying to find that stretch. So I shift my hip out. And then I turn it in and boom. There's the stretch. So I shift the hip out and it's in there. The way to describe it is most people are going to say, I don't know what muscle that is. I don't know what stuff that is, but it's there. It's surrounding that hip socket. Now, once I'm here, we're not just going to chill and do nothing, right? That's not going to be enough force to actually create change in the hip capsule. So once we find the position of that stretch, what we need to do is we need to then contract. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to externally rotate. So if you look here, I'm going to think about externally rotating that direction. So one more time, I'm going to externally rotate as I think about winding up the hip further. We're going to do that as an isometric. Now, you got to make sure that if you feel pain or discomfort in the knee, you get it in a position where you feel this in the hip. If you're feeling pain and discomfort in the knee and you just start contracting, the force is not going into the hip. So we're going to create that torque and then we're going to try to wind up even further. Okay, so one more time. And remember, you might not feel the stretch evenly. You might feel this way more on one hip for this versus the other. So, right here, go ahead and create that wind up. And then get that hip shift right there. A little bit of anterior pelvic tilt, and boom. And then I know it's a little bit hard to see. I've got a little bit of a shadow, but I'm going to start slowly winding up, thinking about my heel bone into the squat rack. I'm going to think about creating torque via external rotation. And then I'm going to build up to my safest and greatest effort, realizing that it takes effort to create change at the capsule. Obviously, I'm skipping steps. Normally, we'd warm up. And then I think about, like I said, to get deeper in the stretch, I can create a little bit of that shift. So notice I'm trying to shift my hip out. That's going to create a little adduction. I can go into more anterior tilt, or I might have to wind up further, or I can mess with how much hip flexion and extension I have. So I notice I'm making small adjustments here to find where I feel the stretch, and boom, there it is. Once I've got it locked in and I've got that socket stretch, I'm contracting. Boom. Okay, so on the other side, same thing, just showing you a different angle. So there I am. I split my hips. Then I go ahead and I wind up. So I like to start with my hip over my knee. Then I wind up. Once I wind up, I create that shift. So I shift my hip bone out. A little bit of anterior tilt. And then boom. And there's that good stretch. And then once again, find your angle. Search and destroy. Notice how I'm tilting my pelvis. I'm shifting my femur. I'm finding that deepest, darkest part of my hip, and then I can create my contractions from there. Okay, guys, that is going to be your quadruped hip internal rotation. It's a very unique angle, and for a lot of people, they're going to find a part of their hip that they've never stretched before, or maybe in another stretch like the 90-90 they haven't quite felt. This is a real good way of teaching people how to move the pelvis over the femur, which is how you're going to get really good internal rotation. And I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this variation because one of the hardest things about hip internal rotation is people get the concept, oh, my hip should rotate. But if you don't feel the capsule, which is the deepest part of the hip, winding up and stretching, if you don't feel it, if you don't feel that connective tissue winding up, loading, and stretching, it's really hard to actually improve hip internal rotation. And a lot of people, to be honest, in the 90-90 stretch or other stretches, they just don't feel it. They feel discomfort in their knee, or they don't really feel much going on. So this is really going to help you feel that socket stretch, which is going to be, like I said. Now, remember, we can't relax our way to change, so we need to make sure that we do this at the appropriate intensity, and over time, we progressively overload this. If you're just turning and, so if you just sit here, so if I just go here and I just wind up my hip, like nothing's going to change, right? To change stuff, you have to change, and water has to get hot enough to boil. So make sure in your internal rotation stretch that you get water hot enough so it's boiling, right? So we have to hit a certain intensity. Now, the great thing about this stretch is I can take that same concept to other internal rotation stretches. So if I'm in quadruped here, okay, and then I pop up, I can do that same thing where I wind up, I adduct, I get a little bit of anterior tilt, and then boom. And then now you can start to feel the difference between a stretch and a capsular stretch or a deep stretch. Lots of people, when they go to stretch, they're just trying to get the time done. They're just trying to do the sets and reps. So they simply just go into the stretch. They don't even care if they're stretching the right stuff, the deepest stuff, or if they're doing it at the right intensity to actually get the change. Most people are just trying to get in and out, which, like, I understand, but the whole point is if you don't stretch the stuff that you need to stretch, and if you don't stretch it at the right intensity for the right duration and for as many times as you need to throughout the week, you're not going to see a difference, right? The whole reason why people stretch is to achieve something. It's not to not achieve something, okay? So that is going to be a new favorite internal rotation stretch, and I think you guys will like it. If you enjoy the stretch, give me a like. If it helps you out, drop a comment. And if this was helpful to someone else, go ahead and click that share, and I will see you guys in the next one.